Now we want to begin our incredible journey into the lost years and secret teachings of Jesus. This 7-part series is broken down into 7 modules, so let's just take a quick look at what we're going to be looking at. Today we're going to begin with the great spiritual mysteries and the return of the King. And in Module 2, we're going to take on the birthday of a king, which involves the Nativity, the knowledge of the Magi and who they truly were, and when Jesus really was born, and what that star of Bethlehem was. In Module 3, we're going to step into the wisdom of the ancient Essenes, the mysterious Essenes that lived in Qumran, that had a school in Mount Carmel, and find out about his many years among the Essenes and what they would have taught him and the evidence that we have for his years among them. In Module 4, we're going to be stepping into the Celtic mysteries. This is Jesus and the Druids. And I love this section because the Druids were so amazing, and they really had so much mysticism and wisdom that was encoded in symbology. So you're going to get an opportunity throughout this whole process to learn a little about hermetics, which is the secret symbol language of the soul that the ancient masters encoded their wisdom in. In Section 5, we're actually going to be stepping, we should have said this in Section 5, we're going to be stepping into Jesus and the Holy Grail. And I guess I didn't change this on here because we decided we were going to allow India and Persia to be Section 6. And then Module 7 becomes not just the secret teachings of Jesus, but Jesus and the Egyptian mysteries. So we want to begin part 1 now as we take a look at Jesus and the great spiritual mysteries. I love this image. Isn't it totally beautiful? Here he is walking on water. In the last few decades, for the first time in a long time, there have been questions, deeper questions that have come forward about the lost years of Jesus and the life of Jesus. And for the first time in a long time, people have begun to ask questions like, was Jesus married? Did he have descendants? Did it make his message any less important? Did it make him any less holy if he had had a wife? And in fact, what we do know is that rabbis were not allowed to be rabbis in the Jewish religion unless they were married. This was fundamental because it was believed that you could not truly understand the plight of your fellow men or women unless you yourself were a householder. It's only in the process of being a husband or a wife and having children and grandchildren that we can truly embrace the full human experience. And so this is certainly something that I believe that Jesus did, although clearly his mission was front and center. So Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, and the movie that came out around it really brought these questions to the forefront. In truth, when we think about what we know about Jesus, everything that we think we know comes from what we call the New Testament. And of course, the New Testament is a collection of 26, 27 books of the New Testament, but only 4 of them were actually written by the apostles that really knew Jesus. All the rest of these books are written by someone else, and 13, about half of them were written by Paul. And if you remember, Paul was actually Saul. He was a Jewish tax collector who really persecuted Jesus until he had his own very profound experience on the road to Damascus, where he was struck blind, and he went through a revelatory experience. And then because he was a Roman citizen, unlike most of the rest of the Jews, he was able to go into Rome, and he was able to be protected by the laws of Rome in such a way that he was able to bring his understanding of what Christianity was, or what he believed it to be, out. And that's sort of the version of Christianity that we have today, which is Pauline Christianity. And it's not to say that Paul was not an intelligent, well-intended man who did great good in getting the message out, but it is to say that he actually never studied with Jesus. He actually never knew Jesus directly. So that is an important thing for us to remember. So what evidence can we gather from the stories that are in those 4 Gospels in the New Testament? First off, we know that Jesus taught forgiveness. This is a core and at the heart of his very message: love, compassion, and forgiveness of others. Remember the famous story in which he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Basically, he's teaching each one of us to be self-reflective and for us to be busy working on ourselves instead of being busy judging others. Second, we know that he had a great love and tenderness for children because he could see the soul shining within the children, and he could see sort of past all, these are, children have not been layered yet with all the negative conditioning, all the dramas and the traumas, hopefully, that many adults have gone through. And so he even said, except as you become as little children, meaning with that level of purity and beauty and innocence, you shall not see the kingdom of heaven. So this was at the core of his teachings as well. Third, Jesus was a great protector of animals, and perhaps you don't know it as much from the four Gospels, but certainly I speak about it in both of my books that have to do with Jesus, how he was a huge advocate for animals. He was probably largely vegetarian, although I'm sure he ate some fish, and he probably ate, lamb on, during Passover. So it wasn't like he couldn't eat meat, but this was not really what he was about. I have stories in my books really about him protecting lions who came and sat at his feet, him protecting donkeys and burros and horses, him protecting cats and birds. He loved birds. So he was a great protector. He was, in fact, as they say, the good shepherd, not only for humanity, but for the animals. And I think a lot of these teachings were taken out of the New Testament because, of course, the New Testament was ultimately compiled by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, had been around for, probably about 450 years at the time that Jesus was born. And they definitely liked their wine and their meat. And so they really didn't want to have a religious leader that taught them to be mostly vegetarians. So they kind of exited that from the Gospels. We also know from many, many stories in the New Testament that Jesus healed the sick, as well as raising the dead. And of course, this is quite remarkable. There are many people in the world today that are awakening to their healing gifts. So we could say, they also can sometimes affect miracle cures, like my mom speaking in tongues. But how many of us can say we know anyone that's ever raised the dead? That's quite a remarkable thing, to call a spirit back into a body after the spirit has already left it. He also did remote healing. Now, this is one of the examples. You remember this centurion that came to him, followed him, and said, my child is dying at home. Can you please heal her? And I think he touched the hem of Jesus's robe. And Jesus said, go home, your child is well. And when the centurion got there, the child, in fact, had made a miraculous recovery. So how did he do it? The child wasn't there. This is called distance healing or remote healing. And again, these are things that we are seeing today with some of our own people who are beginning to develop these abilities. And as Jesus said, these things I do, you too shall do in greater. However, in order to do them, we actually have to step into alignment with our own mastery and really with the Christed Spirit that dwells within us all. We also have reports of him doing remarkable things that have to do with the control of the elements. For example, the amazing story when he walks on water during the storm and gets to the boat that Peter's in and then tries to get Peter to walk on the water as well. And he seemed to be able to control the wind. There are also some amazing stories in a book called He Walked the Americas that was written by the daughter of an anthropologist. And as the anthropologist's father traveled from place to place, of course, he took his daughter with him, including stories in Hawaii, in the Polynesian Islands, stories in South America, stories in Central America, and stories in North America, where a person completely meeting Jesus's description, complete with the white gown, the gashes in the hands and the feet, the the beard, Roman clothes, surrounded by apostles. It appears that there is evidence that after the crucifixion, Jesus took on the mission of going to the other side of the world and actually brought enlightenment to many of the people in the Americas. And there are many stories there about him being able to, again, command the animals, call the wind, call the waters, walk on the water, and control the elements, even to the point of touching the earth and being able to start an earthquake that destroyed something that was harming others. And so he seemed to have control over all these elements. He's often depicted in the paintings of great artists throughout the centuries with a brilliant halo. This halo is called an aura. All of us have an aura. An aura is actually an envelope around the human body of the energy system, the life force of the soul itself. Now, most of us can't see the aura unless we have trained our clairvoyant vision, but we all have one. But most of our auras are pretty mixed, and they can even be muddy. Anybody who's ever felt in love, you can just feel that little pink champagne bubble energy coming up in your aura. Anyone that's ever been angry or furious, you can sort of feel those red lightning bolts. If you've ever experienced envy or jealousy, you can feel that sort of dark green energy, not healing green, but kind of envious green, pea green with envy. But so in order to have an aura like this, a golden aura, a white aura, imagine how much work someone would have to do in order to really hold that kind of Christed frequency. And so I love a lot of these depictions. You can see again and again in some centuries it became very stylized, but you can see the rays coming out of it. And of course they built in aspects of the fleur-de-lis, which we'll be talking about later in this series, and the importance of that symbology. And here we have other depictions from artists, and they're actually literally showing the 4 quadrants of the brain that recent brain research scientists have told us exist. The right and the left bicameral side. So very, very interesting. We know that Jesus taught the power of forgiveness, the power of unconditional love and kindness, and the law of karma. The law of karma is basically that what we do to others will come back to us. What we sow in life is ultimately what we will reap, not only in this life, but on the other side of the veil. When we die and we go to the other side, which is actually a lot of what my newest book is about, we step into the landscapes of heaven. And based on the vibration we have, the thoughts we have, the consciousness we have, the goodness that we have done and shown to others, the kindness and the compassion, and how we have used the time that's been given to us, this helps us to either accelerate and move forward in our spiritual evolution, or to become more retarded, or to just tread water and stand still. And of course, as souls, when we get to the other side, we don't want to tread water and stand still. Many times we come over here all eager beaver, but then we face setbacks, and eventually we sort of become depressed, or we give up, or we stop trying. And of course, that's really not what our lives are meant to be. They're meant to be lives of meaning and purpose, sometimes in the smallest ways and sometimes in the largest ways. And so, we're always having to work within and also ask how we can serve without. So this is at the core of his teachings, which of course is part of what some of the greatest spiritual teachers have taught, is that what we do comes back to us. Yet, for all that we do know in these Gospels, there are many, many unanswered questions that still remain about his many years. So let's just take a look at a few of these questions that we're going to be answering in this series. For example, where did Jesus go during the 30 missing years before his ministry began? And we're going to take a look at how long that period of time actually was. Where did he learn to do his miracles? Did it just come naturally? Did he always do them? Which is kind of like, what is implied in Christian religion. Or was there a process through which he learned to activate these gifts and abilities as he grew up and as he became a master initiate of these great spiritual mysteries? What was his connection with the mysterious Magi? And who the heck were the Magi to begin with? Did they all come from the same country? Did they come from 3 different countries. Why were they showing up? Why were they bringing him the myrrh and the frankincense and the gold? What the heck did all that mean symbolically? We're going to be taking a look at all this. What were his teachings to his disciples in private? What are the things that we don't have in the New Testament? And these are one of the things that I really wanted to know, that I address in my books, and you'll be learning a little bit about in this course. Was Jesus ever married? Certainly there seems to be some pretty serious evidence that he was. For example, in the Gospel of Philip, he refers literally to Mary Magdalene by the term that meant companion or wife or mate. And as I said, rabbis were not allowed to become rabbis unless they were married. So the chances are very good that he was married. And does that make his teachings any less important or holy or wise? Absolutely not. In fact, it's very important, I think, to realize that he fully embraced the human experience. Did Jesus have any descendants? Now, I know this is a very controversial subject, but we're going to take a real look at the evidence about this as one of many, many things we're going to discuss. This is a stained glass window, for example, in the island of Mull in Scotland, and we're going to be talking about this when we get to our British part of our program, our Scottish part. But you can see in it that Mary Magdalene is here, and she certainly appears to be pregnant. And the Scots and the Brits actually have an enormous amount of hidden lore, because this is, of course, where Joseph of Arimathea took the very first Christian church and set up the first community in the world in 37 AD. So certainly there's a lot of evidence for some of the original teachings and the true history of Jesus up in the Celtic Isles. Who or what is the Holy Grail? Have you ever asked yourself, what the heck was it? I mean, certainly the legends of King Arthur from around 500 or 600 AD have lived on for over 1,500 years. What the heck were they searching for with the Holy Grail? Was it really just a cup? The cup used in the Last Supper? Did it symbolize Mary Magdalene herself? Does it symbolize the heirs, the descendants, the biological descendants of Jesus and Mary? Or was it a sacred cloth? Now, most of you don't know about the mandelion, but I'm going to teach you a little bit about this in just a moment. The mandelion, of course, was something that the Crusaders were fighting over for centuries. What the heck was the mandelion? Well, it was a cloth believed to have been imprinted with the image of Jesus's face. And you can see here, this is a cathedral, I think, in Greece, and you can see a depiction of this. Now, some say that when he was going up to the cross, on the long walk, someone handed him a cloth and he wiped his face, and his face was imprinted on it. And that's actually, and there's another version where he was baptized by John the Baptist and he wiped his face then in the River Jordan, and supposedly the face got imprinted on it. But there's another possibility for what the mandelion might have actually been, and it could absolutely have been the Shroud of Turin. Now, the shroud, of course, is a very controversial garment. I've actually had the pleasure and the honor of seeing it in New York, and also when it came to Atlanta some years ago on display. It's a linen shroud that you would certainly think after 2,000 years would have completely fallen apart. But it literally has an image of a man that was about 6 feet tall burned on it. And you can see here, this would have been where the creases are. Okay, but you have literally the crown of thorns with the blood, dried blood here. You have the nail wounds in the wrist and in the feet, and you actually have blood trickling from the side of the body. And so what's happened is when they have actually matched this incredible image that has been blazoned on the shroud and extracted from it the face of what this person would look like, this is the face that we have found. And of course, that certainly looks a great deal like what we are told the great Master Jesus looked like. And this, of course, is a color rendering of that image, and it's just quite incredible to me. It has such an enormous presence, doesn't it? I actually have this in my office. I think it's very powerful. So there's still many, many unanswered questions, and let's just take a look at what we do know in the New Testament. Basically, there are 4 gospel accounts in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are actually all believed to derive from a common source. And biblical scholars call this the book of Q. In other words, they believe there was a book that they said, well, let's write this one, and this one. And each one of them depicts some of the same events in the life of Jesus, but also some different events. So in brief, Matthew is believed by many to have been written later specifically to promote the concept of Jesus fulfilling the Jewish prophecies of the coming Messiah. So it starts off with his genealogy, his Hebrew genealogy from David and Abraham, and then it goes on to Mary discovering that she's with child. Mark starts with John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, and of course the remarkable dove descending on Jesus that says, I'm in my son I'm well pleased, giving a blessing on his ministry. Luke starts with the announcement of John the Baptist's birth and then goes on to the angel Gabriel coming to tell Mary of Jesus' impending birth. Now, John, the Gospel of John is different. John, was probably my favorite Gospel. I really like that one the most. And it starts with, in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos, and then it comes right to John the Baptist being asked if he's Elijah reincarnated or come again. That's what is he Elijah come again means. Is it the soul of Elijah who has returned in another lifetime, in another body? So this is sort of a very short overview, but of course all of them have a lot of content in them. But most of us don't know that there are over 50 additional gospels that were actually written by apostles and people who knew Jesus and studied with him directly. And for whatever social, political, financial reasons, these gospels did not make it into the New Testament. So we have the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of my very favorite. If you guys haven't seen that one, that is one of the ones I would definitely say to pick up, the Gospel of Thomas here. It's really got some of his most amazing teachings in it, very pure teachings. So this is a must read. It's not a big book. You can see it's very small, but really great. The Gospel of Philip, which actually is the one that has the information about how Jesus used to kiss Mary Magdalene on the mouth. And the male apostles were apparently somewhat jealous and would say, why do you favor her, so much? And Jesus would say, you know not the mysteries of marriage. So he's telling us right then that he has a depth of connection and love for Mary Magdalene that no matter how much he loves his apostles, goes beyond that. So he's telling us he was married. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Holy 12. I talk about these in my book in length. And the Book of Love. This was held by the Cathars before the Catholic Church destroyed them around 1247 or 1249 AD. This was a book reportedly written by Jesus or dictated by Jesus to the beloved the disciple John, and it was known as the Book of Love. The Dialogues with the Savior, the Secret Book of John, the Secret Book of James, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel to the Egyptians, the Apocalypse of Paul, and the Apocalypse of Peter. These are just some of 50, and there's a lot of them out there that we've discovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts, which we'll be talking about later in this program. In the Bible, if we really stop to think of it, we only know of about 3.5 years of Jesus' life. First, there's the story of the wise men and the Nativity, and of course Mary and Joseph trying to get to Bethlehem, and how there was no room in the inn, and how they had to stay in sort of a cave that had a shed built in the front of it, like a manger for the animals. And this is a place, the kind of places that the Essenes had in many places, because their people didn't have a lot of money to stay in expensive inns. So this is, of course, where Jesus is reported to have been born. And we see in this beautiful painting the three wise men coming forward to honor the child. And we also see this incredible astrological conjunction going on in the background. This was actually a painting, I think, that was commissioned by Paul Perry, who's a very good writer, who's also written on the lost years of Jesus. And I think it just beautifully depicts the elegance of that whole scene. We know, of course, the next time we hear about him He's with his parents. He's going down from northern Galilee into southern Judea because this is what all the boys did when they were 12 years old in order to basically do what we call bar mitzvah, which is what? To show that they have knowledge of the scripture, the Hebrew scripture, and that they've been trained properly. And so there was a whole caravan of Jewish people that came down from Galilee at that time. And of course, the story was that there were so many when they were going back, they didn't realize that Jesus was not with them. And of course, they had to turn around and go back probably a whole day. And they found him literally in the synagogues with the rabbis. And he was absolutely astounding the rabbis. And the next time we see Jesus is 18 years later. Now, that's if we believe the traditional version that most of us have been taught in church, which was that basically Jesus started his ministry at the age of 30 and then had his crucifixion when he was 33. That's the traditional version I was taught. However, as you will see, there's some real reason to doubt that that's the true timeline. But even if it was, with the 3 years of his ministry in Galilee and Judea, and of course the story of his crucifixion, that means that there would be a big chunk of time. And most of us don't realize that actually many of the early Christians knew that Jesus actually had been put to death probably in his mid to late 40s. And I actually talk about the arguments for this and the history behind it. And the reason that we think that Jesus started his ministry at 30 to 33 was because in the Gospel of Luke, Luke wrote that Jesus appeared to be a man around the age of 30. Now, of course, Luke, many of you may not realize, did not actually know Jesus either. He was a disciple of Paul's. He was a Greek physician who came to Christianity late, and he came to Christianity through the teaching Christianity. So again, he actually did not have a real experience with Jesus, except perhaps on the inner levels. So some believe that his ministry only lasted 1 year, while others say, no, it definitely lasted 3 years. So if the Gospel of Luke tells us, now Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age. And Luke says that Jesus appeared to be a man around 30. But of course, if you are a vegetarian and you exercise, as I'm sure he did traveling so much, and you meditate, even if he was 40 years old, he could easily have looked 30. But that very traditional telling of Jesus' life would still leave 25 years of his life unaccounted for in the Bible. The Gospel of John, however, actually implies that Jesus was closer to 50 years old at the time that he began his ministry. In John 8:56, then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And then the Jews go on to say to him, are you crazy, man? You're not yet 50 years old. So if that is true, then let's just say he started his ministry around the age of 45, okay, or 47. That means over 40 years of his life from the age of 12 to the age of 45 is unaccounted for. And of course, we're also counting those years between the time when he was born and he went to Egypt with his parents. And, then the next time we hear from him, he's 12 years old. So we have to ask ourselves, if we stop to really think, what the heck happened in those interviewing years? So between the ages of 12 and 30, or between the ages of 12 and 40, basically Jesus simply vanishes. So this 7-part series is about being on the trail of the lost years and the secret teachings of Jesus. And key to understanding where he was, where he trained, where he went, and who was supporting him in his mission long before he surfaced back in Galilee is the White Brotherhood hypothesis. Now, for those of you who don't know what the White Brotherhood is, this is a very big subject because, as I said, the great spiritual mystery schools were in play, in full swing, for at least 4,000 years or longer before the birth of Jesus, and at least some 400 years after Jesus. They were composed of a group of master initiates and sages who taught the spiritual enlightenment of the soul. They taught all the things we might think of in a university: math, science, arts, music, the humanities, architecture, law, healing, spiritual principles, moral precepts, all of these things, and they taught the immortality of the soul itself. Now, in the Bible, we hear about one of these in particular in the Old Testament called the Order of Melchizedek. This is in the Old Testament when Abraham is initiated into the Order of Melchizedek. And the Melchizedeks were certainly, we can say they were magicians, they were mathematicians, they were scientists, they were people who studied the laws, the spiritual laws of the universe reflected in the physical human world. And we see, of course, this beautiful chalice in front of it. Now, the purpose of the mystery schools throughout time was to teach the doctrine of one great creator or one God, one intelligence behind it all, the resurrection of man to eternal life, the dignity of the human soul, and to lead the people to see the shadow of the divine or the deity in the beauty, magnificence, and splendor of the universe. And this was written by a 33-degree Mason called Robert McCoy. These great spiritual mystery schools, were all over the world. However, they focused, and they began, the motherland was in Egypt. These schools taught basically that we are immortal souls having a human physical experience, and so that we need to make every single life count. We're not just, bodies that might possibly have souls. They really knew about the deeper mysteries, maybe because they weren't on their cell phones all the time, or they weren't on their computers or on their television sets, or, so preoccupied as we are in our fast-paced, exterior-based society. These societies were more interior-based. They taught the importance of morality and truth, honesty and kindness, compassion, the spiritual principles that govern the soul, which are the principles of karma and reincarnation. They taught right action and right thinking and living in alignment with our higher self. A lot of these are the precepts that we see in the 10 Commandments, right? Don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill. Don't steal your neighbor's wife unless you want him to maybe come over and take your head off. So these are basic moral precepts that all people need to learn to live by, because if we don't, we wind up creating karma and pain and hardship and betrayal for ourselves and for those around us. So when we start looking at some of the ways that they taught, they believed that there was a natural union between science, religion, and philosophy, that there was like a triumvirate, and that they needed to run checks and balances. And this is something, again, I think we really have lost in the last, 1,500 years. For a long time, religion ran amok with lots of superstition, and most people couldn't read. The Gospels were in Latin. If you spoke, Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic or English or French, you couldn't even read them. You just had to kind of go to church and take everyone's word for it about what they said. And so the ancient worlds believed that we need to, whatever we believe, we must observe in the world around us and see if it correlates with science. The principle as above, so below, as below, so above. The philosophies that we develop from this, that give us societal rules to live by and wisdom, really need to connect with what we believe spiritually and what we dedicate ourselves to. So philosophy is both scientific and religious. Science is both philosophic and religion is both scientific and philosophical. And today in our modern world, we're starting to come back around to a merger between science and spirituality, and I'm so glad to see it. And this is with the discovery of quantum physics, which tells us that our consciousness actually affects the subatomic matter of the universe. And of course, subatomic matter makes up atomic matter, meaning that something like magic, is a spiritual law that is possible, that our thoughts can help to create our reality, that the universe is conscious. And this is how prayer works. That's how the principle that prayer is based on, is through aligning ourselves with the higher frequency. We call in the forces of light to assist us in manifesting what we want. The Great Spiritual Mystery Schools also taught about the existence of these multi-level dimensions, that Earth is one vibrational level, but that there are others. And if we can reach through the veil or pull back the veil through meditation, through prayer, through soul travel, through spending time in nature, we can begin to get a glimpse of the universe behind the physical material world. Now, throughout the course of uh, this class, I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of Hermetic symbols, and this is an easy one for me to point out a few important things. We see the sun, which represents the solar masculine energy, the moon, which represents the feminine lunar or receptive energy. We see the star, which is the bright and shining star of the awakening of our own soul consciousness. We see the tree of life here. And so in order to pull back the veils to these higher worlds, we must find a way to combine the masculine and feminine within ourselves to awaken that inner light, and then we can climb the tree and access the connection with these higher dimensions or planes. The tree of life is a very big conversation, a very deep one. I have a whole discourse dedicated to it in my mystery school and a DVD on it. But basically, the ancients looked at this as the way of the return back to source. And as we know, Jesus taught something called the way. Buddha taught the middle way. Thoth taught the ancient way. These are all the same teachings, which are basically that we must merge the masculine and feminine together in order to find a middle channel. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, when you make the two eyes into one, the inner into the outer into the inner, the male into the female, and the female into the male, then you shall see the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about a spiritual technology that we're going to be talking about and teaching in this class, where through activating both sides of our brain, we awaken the third eye and we gain access into these higher inner worlds. And you can see the tree of life here, and here we are in the 7 layers of the dimensions. In order to get out, we get trapped in this labyrinth. We must come into the center of ourselves in order to find a journey and a path out, and once again climb the tree of life and connect in with this. Now, the tree of life was known as the Kabbalah in Jewish mysticism, and there's so much I can say about this amazing wisdom path, but this is just one of the many, many things that was taught within the mystery school. Now, these mystery school chapters were set up by the great God of wisdom, God with a little g, Thoth. Thoth was originally known as Nengishzida. He was a Sumerian Anunnaki god who came to this planet a really long time ago. These beings live an enormous amount of time, really, really in the tens of thousands of years, because their life cycle is much longer than our human life cycle. But he became known in Egypt for many thousands of years as Thoth, the god of wisdom. He became known in the Greek philosophy as Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. He became known in the Roman culture as Mercury, the scribe of the gods, and also the great healer. And of course, one of his symbols was the caduceus symbol that's now used all over the world as a symbol of healing. Certainly the motherland of the mysteries at the time that Jesus was living was in ancient Egypt, and that was the place that was closest to him. But of course, you can't rule out India, because India is so ancient and so rich with ancient knowledge and culture. Eventually he was to go to India. But the Egyptian sages knew that he was coming, and they had prophesied his coming. Throughout almost all the different chapters, there were 3 levels of initiation, and these are represented by the crown on the top of Isis's head. And so we have the first level that was dedicated to the divine mother and daughter, the second level to the divine father and son, and the third level that allowed integration of the 3. These 3 triune aspects represent our physical nature, our emotional, and our mental. And of course, we are spiritual beings, and it's our spirit or our soul that must organize these 3 into balance with one another. And there were great ceremonies that were set up all over the world in these mystery schools that not only taught, very grounded information like what we see in our universities today with math and sciences and astronomy and astrology and history and chemistry and biology and healing and all the things that we can think of as the sciences, and the arts as well, painting, music, dance. But they also gave the initiate a direct experience of their own eternal and divine nature by providing what we would think of as near-death experiences, real near-death experiences where people were thrown out of their bodies, found themselves on the other side, and got to experience those inner worlds for themselves. And then they would come back from these journeys knowing that, they need to really get with the program and make good use of this life. And that lying and cheating and stealing were just out of the question, because what we do in this lifetime directly affects not only our next life when we reincarnate, but where we go when we go to the other side. So, of course, they had obelisks and they had pyramids and they had temples. Some of these temples are like the Great Pyramids. Some of them are like Stonehenge or the stones of Karnak in Brittany in northwestern France. So these temples existed all over the world. And we can see here Britain, Scotland, Ireland, Egypt, Greece, India, over in the Americas, the Mayan Indians and the Incans. At the time that Jesus lived, these are some of the many chapters. You can see in Israel, the Essenes were holding the higher wisdom there, and the Kalu. The Kalu were the priests from Atlantis that had great scientific knowledge as well, and they were very judicious in sharing it because, of course, all you have to have is a despotic king to try to capture somebody that had this advanced knowledge, which is one of the things we see that happen in the Middle Ages when the idea of Greek fire, took off, which is basically burning oil and coal. France and Britain, the Druids, Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries, and of course there were also the Dionysian Mysteries there, and the Orphic Mysteries in Greece. In Rome, the Mithric Mysteries, and in fact, the Emperor Constantine was the head of the Mithrid order, the sole Invictus at the time that he adopted Christianity. In India, we had the Brahmins and the Buddhists. In Egypt, of course, we had the ancient mysteries, and the Essenes were frequently going to Egypt, and they also worked with a community called the Therapeutae, which are basically the Essenes in Egypt. They got up every morning and did sun salutations, and once we get around to talking about the Essenes, I'll be telling you more about how these chapters really express their wisdom. They're quite interesting. Persia, there was the Saramang Society, and of course the Magi and Zoroastrianism. And in Greece and Egypt, there was Pythagorean knowledge taught, Socratic knowledge taught, the Stoic school, the school of Epicurus, and other intellectual schools that were all in Alexandria, the city on the northern coast of Egypt, and also, of course, in ancient Greece. Now, these are the places where Jesus actually studied. Of course, he was with the Essenes. Mary was an Essene. John the Baptist was an Essene. Many of the people in the Bible that we hear about, the apostles, were Essenes, not all of them. In England or Britain, he studied with the Druids. In India, with the Brahmins. And of course, he spent 6 years with the Buddhist community in Rajagira that acknowledged Jesus as the second Buddha that had been predicted some 500 years earlier by the first Buddha to have come. And of course, the Chaldean and Persian mysteries, he learned about the star mysteries, which are very profound in that culture, which we'll be learning about in this class. And in Egypt, he trained in the temples of Heliopolis. That's the Greek name for the city of On, which was the major center. And we'll be learning all about his time in Egypt. So this is who the wise men were. They were sages or masters or wisdom keepers from the great mystery schools that came to honor his birth, because they were also astrologers and astronomers, and they were paying attention. They knew from the prophecies that he was coming. The question was when. And these, of course, are three of their names. And we'll be talking about the wise men later in much more depth. These are some of the great avatars that came before Jesus in the different countries of the world. Lao Tzu, which of course he's the founder of the path of Taoism. Pythagoras, he literally was born around the same time in ancient Greece, and his teachings we're still using today in geometry. Buddha, the great Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, was born around 566, very close in time, but in India. Zoroaster in Persia, and Heraclitus in ancient Greece. Confucius in shortly thereafter, then Socrates around the same time. You can see literally 9 years apart, and then Plato followed shortly afterwards. So this is just a tour de force, and here's some of the dates just to give you an idea how these great masters, these are just the ones that we know that became the most famous, and certainly there were others, but for at least 500 to 600 years before the birth of Jesus, these guys were coming in, they were setting up spiritual schools and philosophy, strengthening the spiritual core of each one of these nations so that Jesus would have these schools to be able to come and study at. And they really came in preparation, not only to do their own work, but really at a bigger level to lay down these foundational pieces. They were all awaiting what's called the return of the phoenix. Now, the phoenix is what? It's a symbol. It's a hermetic symbol that symbolizes these great solar lords that are direct emanations of the Divine Father energy that periodically come to Earth to help humanity. You think about it, it's a being that comes in from the higher worlds, a great avatar. He brings his great light to the planet. Usually we kill him. We can see this has happened again and again. However, he sings his song of glory. He brings his wisdom forth before he dies, knowing that he will return, that this is his job. Now, the symbol for this was the phoenix bird, or in Egypt it was called the Benu bird. It means the same thing. And in Heliopolis, which was one of the three great spiritual centers of Egypt, it was probably the oldest one. It was at the where the Nile with all the different parts comes together, about 12 miles north of where the Giza Plateau is. That's where Heliopolis was. And it was in a mighty, mighty center. In its heyday, it had 60,000 priests and priestesses, astronomers, many temples to all the different aspects of the Divine Mother, Father, Son, Daughter, etc. But they also had these incredible obelisks, and at the top of the obelisk was a pyramidion, which is really the capstone. It's the top of the pyramid. And this represented, it was called the Ben stone. So it represented the apex of spiritual enlightenment. And so the Ben stone was again synonymous with the idea of the Benu bird, the phoenix that would return. And this is actually what their version of it looked like. So they chose something like a heron, but you can see they put a crown on the top of it to say it's not just any old ordinary heron living in the marshlands. It's in fact the Benu bird. And here we can see the initiate is praising, all hail. So when you think of the phoenix, think of the Christ energy. That's really what we're talking about here. So this is from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So he's traveling in what's called the boat of a million years into heaven. So this guy, the initiate, has died, okay? And so how can the initiate get into heaven? Well, he has to have the Christed spirit. And we see the colors actually of Osiris in the house of David and Jesus, which were green and black. Those were the colors. And we see him literally in this green and black. So in order to get into heaven, you have to have the good shepherd beside you. You literally move up the dimensions. You can see literally in the tree of life, it's considered that there are 4 major divisions, although there may be other planes, and like 2 planes or 3 planes in a division. But this has to do with the 3 steps of initiation, and the 4 worlds of emanation, and we have to learn to open our third eye and align with the light of consciousness, higher consciousness, and align with the Christed spirit in order to gain the kingdom of heaven. So the phoenix is the Christ to come. It's really the once and future king. And we're going to be returning to this theme again and again throughout this program, because really and truly, why the Arthurian legend has lasted for so long is because there are clues within it, if you understand how to read them, from the round table to the holy chalice to the return of the once and future king, and the one that tries to make right instead of might. In other words, through justice and truth instead of brutality and force. So this is the Maitreya. The Maitreya is the Christ to come. And it said that he will arrive on a white horse in the Prophecies. And so the white horse becomes a symbol of both the Christ to come and also of the divine feminine, of the Sophia energy as well. So it's both the male and the female Christ who returns to our world in this next age. And we see here again an image of this divine feminine energy, the mother god, sitting on the throne of the father god, that is depicted really as the eagle. And you can see he's a 2-headed eagle, because he's both the god of the male god that stays in heaven, that the ancients called Haru, by the way, or a tomb. And he's also the aspect of the male that comes to earth as the divine son. So the true Trinity is not, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. I guess you could say that, but most people have forgotten that the Holy Ghost is the Shekinah, it's the daughter principle. The true Trinity is the divine mother and the divine father and the divine child, the Christed child that comes to earth as either the divine masculine or the divine feminine Christ. And usually they come together in order to enlighten humanity. And you can sort of see the Trinity here of the great crown of heaven. So in the coming modules, I hope you enjoyed this very first one. We're going to be taking on in the next one the Nativity and the Magi, Jesus' time among the Essenes, Jesus' time with the Druids. Then we actually have Jesus and the Holy Grail here, because the Druids were such a long and involved and wonderful section. We decided to give you a whole section on the mysteries of the Holy Grail. And then we'll get to India and Persia, and then Egypt. And I promise you that I will weave in some of the secret teachings of Jesus with this last module on Jesus and the great Egyptian mysteries. So join us next time as we explore part 2, the birth of a king, and we learn about the mysteries of the wise men. Thank you so much for joining us for this very first module. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the other side with part 2. Thanks.